Hello everyone! Thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome to Let's Have Renaissance, a podcast about writing, editing, publishing, the arts, and more. I am Ito Utini.
And I'm Makaya Utini, and today we're speaking with Jane Wong. Jane is the author of the memoir Meet Me Tonight in Atlantic City, as well as 2 books of poetry. She holds an MFA in poetry from the University of Iowa and a PhD in English from the University of Washington. She's a recipient of the Pushcart Prize and fellowships from the Fulbright Program, Artist Trust, Harvard's Woodberry Poetry Room, For Culture, and many more. Jane grew up in a Chinese-American restaurant on the Jersey Shore and now lives in Seattle. We're delighted to have her with us today. Before we begin, I've got a quick announcement for our listeners. We're curating resources for artists and writers on our blog. It's completely free. Check it out at thedatekeepers.com and feel free to reach out anytime and let us know what other resources you want us to build. Also, we'd really appreciate if you'd subscribe, like, comment, and share this podcast with your friends and on your socials so we can reach more people and do more for the creative community. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jane, for joining us. We're really excited to learn about you and your work. Can you please share a bit about you and your work?
Yeah, of course. I'm so excited to chat with you today. I'm Jane Wong. I grew up on the Jersey Shore, so in many ways, very obsessed with water. I always find myself near bodies of water. I'm primarily a poet, but I also have a memoir out, I believe, just in a couple years. So, or I just had it out 2 years ago. And I'm a professor as well. I also do Asian American Studies. I'm also a ceramicist. I do a lot of interdisciplinary art. So for me, it's pretty hard to pin me down to a particular genre. So in many ways, I like to just say I'm a maker. I just like to make things. But words have always been my primary, source of inspiration. But that's a bit about me. I think at the core of it, too, I think poetry isn't everything that I do. So no matter what project I'm working on, I think I always have like a poet's mind. But that's a bit about me.
Did you begin with poetry and then you added other genre and other media, or how did your creative process develop in different media?
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually began as a fiction writer, and I always loved stories. Like, I was just kind of one of those kids that was always at the library, and I hated sometimes how stories would end. Like, I wanted it to end differently, so I'd actually write my ending, what I wanted to happen, and I would slip it in the library book. So I was one of those kids that was like writing stories from the start. So I actually began as a fiction writer, and in college too, that I worked with the incredible Matt Johnson. He was my professor then, and we worked together on a lot of short stories and kind of the start of my writing life. But you know, he would always say, like, you need to push your plot. You need to kind of like develop more tension, and I just struggled with that. And I think that's where I kind of took a poetry class, and I was like, oh, I can still have all the kind of elements of narrative and persona, character, imagery, but then I didn't need to have a plot. Like, I could just allow things to kind of be sitting in the emotional space instead. And so I fell in love with poetry. And to this day, I think Matt's always like, when are you coming back to fiction? And I'm actually working right now on a short story collection, so it's happening. So it's all full circle, but I think I fell in love with poetry because it was, for me at least, the fundamental core of how I can create a world full of sensory detail, full of music, full of formal invention. So yeah, so poetry runs through everything, but so does story too.
And do you teach poetry, fiction, nonfiction, or all of it?
Yeah, I'm primarily a professor who teaches poetry, though I also teach hybrid form. Because I have a PhD in English, specifically Asian American literature, I also teach Asian American studies. So I am kind of secretly a scholarly nerd as well. I always forget that I did a PhD. I guess that was like 5 years of my life. But yeah, it was totally critical. So I do have that background in Asian American literature. And I also just started teaching some really unique classes outside of the university that combine other art forms. So I just taught a poetry and ceramics class, and that was so beautiful and so fun to kind of work with students who are playing with physical like clay and building vessels, while also kind of like writing poems that speak to those vessels. I actually had students put their poems inside the vessels, because when you fire them in the kiln, they kind of burn. So it's almost ritualistic, I suppose, if you think of it that way. So yeah, I've been tinkering with that a lot, but I like to play a lot when I teach. So in some of my poetry classes, we actually make handmade paper as well. It's nothing like bringing a blender to class.
That's so cool.
That's cool.
Yeah. I think brains get wired differently when they have to deal with like words and then physical objects and transforming things from one medium to another. That's cool. I don't think enough teachers do that. Who or what are the primary influences on your work? Do you gravitate toward books that are like everything but plot? They're like detail and senses and whatnot floating in ether, or do you actually gravitate more toward plot-based books? Like, if you had to name your literary influences or even influences in other media, who would they be?
I love it all. I think that I tend to gravitate, regardless of the genre, to kind of language that is very visceral and very sensory oriented, which also happens in novels, right? Like Toni Morrison, for instance, like her prose is just rich with visceral detail, and there's not a single sentence there that doesn't feel like kind of painting to me. But also her narrative and her plot is just so strong too. So I feel like no matter what genre it is, I feel really akin to anyone who's trying to understand the kind of emotional landscape, I suppose, of how to express an emotion. So I've always loved Toni Morrison. Lucille Clifton is one of my favorite poets of all time. I think probably because her poems tend to be short, and yet you read them over and over again, and it's like one single phrase or line almost is like its own world. It's the very almost philosophical. She has a kind of element of invocation that I really love. Like there's something very deeply spiritual about her work. I also gravitate towards pretty experimental texts too. One of my all-time, favorite books that is not even necessarily a book that can be quote-unquote read is Teresa Hawkins' Dictee, and that book is very hybrid. So it includes poetry, prose, memoir, photographs, ephemera, like a lot of really interesting historical documents. And so in many ways, that book is meant to be, I guess, experienced rather than read in a more linear way. And so I find myself really kind of influenced by her work and the risks that she's taking too. So it's a huge range. I think that sometimes I'm even very inspired by cookbooks because I write a lot about food. So I don't know. And of course with artists too, I tend to be deeply inspired by artists who tend to, I guess, take risks, like Ai Weiwei, for instance. We just had a huge show of Ai Weiwei's work at the Seattle Art Museum here that just closed, and I was just so deeply moved by some of the pieces that he had in there. So, and again, very risky, very radical work. Yeah.
You were raised by parents who were running a restaurant. Can you tell us a little bit about your life story and what your memoir covers?
Yeah, so I first and foremost always describe myself as somebody who grew up on the Jersey Shore, but I always forget to kind of add to them also a restaurant baby. For me, growing up on the Jersey Shore meant growing up in this strip mall in particular. And, this was a Chinese American takeout restaurant, with the kind of very Americanized versions of Cantonese food. So you're thinking about General Tso's chicken and sweet and sour pork, all these dishes, the egg rolls. And next door to the restaurant was actually a pizzeria and then a beauty store. And so it's this whole strip mall that is so nostalgic to me. And I grew up surrounded by food and just also the stories of customers. And I was always, I guess, like a listener from the start. I was always kind of like stealing little bits and pieces from my customers' stories that I would like interpret into my own kind of creative work too, and writing stories on the backs of like menus. So my memoir really kind of begins in that kind of childhood space on the Jersey Shore in that restaurant, but also begins with my father, who's estranged from me, and the story of his gambling addiction, and that we often went to Atlantic City. And the restaurant is significant because it really was his life's passion. And we joke around, but it's true. I came straight from the hospital to the restaurant, and my bus stop was the restaurant even, which is kind of embarrassing to have your bus stop be a strip mall instead of in like a house on the street or something like that. But my father gambled so much, accrued so much debt that we had to sell the restaurant. And so the story begins there in the memoir, but it goes to so many places. But that's kind of the central core of it, is like food as a means of nourishment, of love, of connection. But food can also be complicated, and there's a lot of grief in a lot of the book as well. So in many ways, my memoir, Meet Me Tonight in Atlantic City, which is, if anyone's a Bruce Springsteen fan will catch that reference there, is really a book that is, kind of all the emotions in one. Like, hopefully there's a little bit of humor and joy, but also a lot of heartache and grief and some trauma in there too, thinking about, the different generations of my family and what they've had to survive over the many decades. But that's a little glimpse. Yeah,
memoir writing requires like so much vulnerability. Can you talk a little bit about the writing process and how you were processing those experiences as you were composing the memoir?
Yeah, that's such a good point. Memoir is so vulnerable, and when you're speaking about kind of trauma, it is the most kind of like the biggest challenge to decide what you want to include and what you want to kind of like leave out. Like, how vulnerable do you want to be when you're writing memoir? And for me, I think mostly because I was pretty certain, and maybe I shouldn't say this per se, but at the time at least, that this would be my only kind of memoir, it was so difficult to write that I was like, you know what, if this is my one shot at writing memoir, I'm going to be as vulnerable as possible and take that risk. And so I think that when I was talking a lot about, familial trauma, that was hard because in some ways I was still grappling with kind of like the grief of, losing my father, but then he still exists somewhere. He just doesn't want to be in our lives. And, all of the kind of, the pain that my mother and her, parents went through the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution. Like, there was a lot of historical research I put in this book as well. And also my own personal trauma and thinking about, domestic violence in terms of so much that I had to really kind of work through on the page, and so it was a huge challenge, but I decided to take the risk because I know that when I read a piece of like work that is so vulnerable, I feel really seen, and I'm writing to whoever's reading it that needs that kind of nod of connection, that hands reaching out. And so for me, it was worth the risk, but also hard because strangers are reading this and they don't know you, and it's intense. I think sometimes when I do book readings or when I was on tour, people would come up to me crying and sharing their life story, and it's emotional. It's very intense, but because they're doing that because I shared mine, and so that to me, I'm so grateful for writing this book as well because of that. So yeah, that's a beautiful question.
And how did your family react to your memoir?
Ooh, that's an even better question. My mom is the star of the memoir. She's, in many ways, that's the center of this book. She was thrilled. I mean, she's like a Leo. And she's like also a tiger in the zodiac too. So she's, let's just say, her energy is very extroverted. She's very kind of the life of the party, and so she was thrilled when the book came out because obviously she's at the center of it, and she's like, oh yeah, I wrote this book because I wrote you. I just love that she said that. She started to sign my books actually when I went on tour with her in Jersey. It was so funny. She just picked up a book and started to sign it with her own signature. And so she was thrilled. I think the rest of my family was a little they're proud of me, but they're also a little kind of like, what is she doing? Why is she kind of making this public? And so there's a little bit, I think everybody else is a little bit like, I wouldn't say suspicious, but just a little bit kind of like, not going to read it, not going to want to know. And so I find that a little kind of strange too, that it's like, people don't, of course, want their secrets told or their stories told. But my goal in writing this book was also to write it with a lot of responsibility. Like I really wanted to speak to stories that would otherwise never get told by, about the lives of, low-income working class folks that, I think I'm really trying to shine a light on their labor and their love. So I think they're proud of me, but they're also a little bit like, what is she doing? Why would she do this? Which is very immigrant. I mean, like, why? Yeah, like, why would you do this?
Yeah, but it's really cool that your mom was supportive.
Yeah, my mom was so thrilled. I was very lucky that when I did my Jersey tour, that she came along to, at least 2 or 3 readings, and she was actually at one of the readings in Jersey City. She was one of my Q&A partners. It was just really fun, and she, loves the mic. Apparently, who knew?
Now, are you working over some of this same material and same emotional landscape again in the fiction, in the short stories you're working on, or are you delving into new territory?
I think after I wrote my memoir, which took about 7 years, I felt like I needed to take a break from writing nonfiction. And so now I'm working on 2 different projects, a short story collection kind of in the genre of speculative fiction horror. And then I'm working on a 3rd collection of poetry right now that also kind of situates itself in a kind of like not quite real world as well. And so, and that kind of really dives into themes of like my mother's garden and what growth means personally since I got out of this kind of really challenging relationship where I was engaged. And I think at the central core, it's about regrowth. And so, yes and no. I think everything's an extension of the thing I wrote before. But I tend to take usually a pretty radical shift when I start a new project, if only to kind of challenge myself. I really do believe that, for artists, each project we do is a challenge. It's trying to push ourselves further into different like portals of imagination.
Would you like to read some of your poetry, prose, or a little from each?
Of course, I would love to. I picked a pretty short passage from my memoir, Meet Me Tonight in Atlantic City. This is actually from a chapter called A Cheat Sheet for Restaurant Babies. And it's actually written in the form of a sort of how-to for the next generation, like the next kid that grows up in the restaurant. A cheat sheet for restaurant babies. How to lob an egg into a parking lot. Wait until it's dark. Settled in dark, not sunset dark. Say 9 p.m. The sound of breaking is better when you can't see it happening. When your father isn't looking, go to the fridge and steal 2 eggs from the bottom of the carton stack and wrap them up in a small towel, folding the towel like you would an origami cup. Sneak out through the back of the restaurant, mind the potholes, and circle around front to the parking lot. Unfold the towel and give your little brother 1 egg. When he says the egg is too cold and it smells rotten like unbrushed teeth, tell him to shut up. Ground your heels into the gravel as you imagine baseball pitchers do to gain traction. Give all your anger over to the egg. Breathe your hot breath on it. Hold it up to the sky like an offering, a sacrifice, this careful thing that could have grown into something else. Tell your brother there's nothing to be afraid of. Tell him to stop shaking. He's no incubator. With your arm bent back at 45 degrees, hurl the egg high into the air, into an arch any city would welcome as a bridge. Hurl the egg and do not think about anything. Not about how your father sloshes an aquarium of whiskey. Not about the growing piles of bills you will have to translate later. You must give the egg all of it. You can open your eyes or close them. It won't matter since you won't see it land. But you will hear it. You will hear your brother squeal like a pig at mealtime. And you will hear the splat, the corpuscular glob of the yolk spreading across the hood of a car. Poor car, you'll think. Poor stupid car. I'll pause there. I'm happy to read another poem or something too, but
We've got time for another, for sure.
I won't read all of it because it's very long, but I'll give you a glimpse of this poem, which is about labor and literal labor, like giving labor, because it's a very matrilineal poem, but also work, of course, and, you know, all the work that my mother and my grandmother have done. The long labors. My grandmother said it was going to be long as you can hold your lineage, depending on how long you can hold your tongue, as long as your tongue can wrap around the pit of some stolen stone fruit, as long as you can hide your pitter-patter face glued in sun-split splinters, lengthening shadows as long as your face, longing to be mirrored back to your daughter, your mother, your grandmother, freckle by freckle, furnished forever across the long, loaming hall. Collapsed in a pool of spit, my mouth over papers, raccoon doctorate, luxurious loser with thin branch fingers, no meat in the palm, no muscle in the bending. The farmer in me is atrophying, the cook, the factory seamstress, the clerk, the mother in me is pooling out. All that I come from, all that I owe to them. What is left of me? What is me? Professorial rat, book leavened and maddened in meetings, chewing at my desk on a frozen anything. Microwave spun and splattered on lessons, wondering who packaged this, who spooned this glacial sauce into this plastic hull, whose hands, whose daughter, does she look like me, does she like dancing in the gloaming, funneled into my greedy mouth, I, daughter of long labors, I, knock off half-price guilt, I, impossible imposter, big words, trying to prove what, and to whom. I wait to be seated at a restaurant. A white person enters and starts to order from me. I want sweet and sour chicken, but without bell peppers and brown rice, and I almost take it down.
Thank you for reading, Jane. We really appreciate you.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was great. Thank you for joining us today. We've had a great time talking with you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Such a joy to be on your podcast.